So Helene Warrench is going to talk about Barry.
Good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to have the honor to introduce our speaker, Barry Rascovar. He's been reporting and editorializing on Maryland and national politics and government since 1969. For over 20 years, he covered the Maryland State House and the Capitol Hill for the Baltimore Sun. Then Barry continued his political column for the Gazette newspapers and the Community Times. Barry's written 3 books about Maryland: Marylanders of the Century, The Great Game of Maryland Politics, and The Life of Kings, the Baltimore Sun and the Golden Age of the American newspaper. Recently, all his writings and more can be found on his blog, and I will also put this in chat, www.politicalmaryland.com. He always has wonderful things and interesting things to say. Barry was born and raised in Baltimore, and the two of us grew up together at Baltimore Hebrew Congregation. He was an honor graduate of Columbia School of Journalism and Dickinson College. For several years, Barry has been teaching politics and government and great decisions for the Senior Adventures and Learning Program at the Community College of Baltimore County, for which I coordinated. And it's always my pleasure to listen to his research, his information, and his evaluations on what's happening in today's politics and government. If you have any questions during Barry's presentation, please put them in chat, and CC Brund will pose your questions and comments at the end of his presentation. Barry, with the inauguration of Joseph Biden yesterday, we look forward to hearing what you have to say about our future in our government and our nation, where we're headed and what we should expect. Barry.
Thank you, Helene.
Good morning. Good to see you.
It's good to see you and the rest of you here on the screen. Sorry I can't be there in person, but one of these days, it'll happen. We can get back together. So hang in there if at all possible, hang in there. I wanted to start by reminding you of an old Chinese saying, and it's been misinterpreted in the West. May you live in interesting times. And we all think, aha, that's a quirky thing to say, but an interesting thing. But indeed, for the Chinese, that was a curse that they would put on someone. What they meant by interesting was a period of upheaval and uncertainty, a period of fear and just loathing. Well, to a large extent, living in interesting times, as the Chinese would have it, is exactly what we're going through right now. All you have to do is mention the coronavirus, the 4 years of the unconventional Trump administration, and the fact that whether we know it or not, we have an extremely troubled economic situation in this country that, if left unattended, could tumble into a deep recession or even a depression. Yes, we live in interesting times, but there are rays of light. And I think you saw a lot of it yesterday. Joe Biden delivered by far his best speech ever yesterday. He stressed conciliation, unity, renewal, empathy, the American spirit, love of country. And he did all of that without bashing Donald Trump, without bashing anybody. Imagine that. After 4 years of presidential bashing, we had a new president who was accenting the positive. So one of the questions is, can Joe Biden, is he capable of leading a reinvention of America? And in his inaugural speech, Biden gave part of that answer, which is that America has always been about reinvention. It's always been about imagining the possibilities and allowing people the ability to go try to make those possibilities reality. Uh, and he said his administration will be a story of hope, not fear, of light, not darkness. This is a marked change from the Trump years. He asked people to contribute to making America better. And to me, it rang very similar to John F. Kennedy's inaugural. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So here we are with a new president who, to some extent, reminds me of Mr. Rogers. Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you be my friend? You know, let's look at the positive. This is Joe Biden. This is someone who doesn't give up just because you oppose his ideas. This is someone who doesn't get angry and then get even. This is someone who sits down and tries to talk things through and see your side. He's what I would call the better angels president. That phrase from Lincoln, the better angels within all of us. That's what Biden sees. That's what he's taken from his religion. He's the eternal optimist, someone who's willing to accommodate, and he understands that communication starts with being a good listener. Compare that to the outgoing president, a total negativist. You could call him the anti-president. That's all he talked about were the things he was against. He fed off the fear and anger that he generated among his supporters. And he and his supporters, ironically, had no proposals to build up America. It was all about tearing it down, tearing down institutions, tearing down and doing away with existing policies. What was to replace it? That's an empty question mark. An empty question mark. Here's an example. When the extremist rioters stormed the US Capitol and broke into the US Capitol, they didn't know what to do once they got inside. You saw all these pictures of them wandering aimlessly through the hallways of the Capitol. They had no plan. They knew they wanted to destroy, but they didn't have the first clue as to how to rebuild, what they wanted to really have happen. And this is typical of the Trump movement. There's been no purpose over the last 4 years, really, other than the glorification of Trump. Now, some people within the Republican Party have plans. They want a very conservative America. And they tried to, Mitch McConnell, for instance, his top priority was putting as many conservative judges on the federal courts as possible. That's a legitimate plan, an idea. You can talk about that, you can argue that, you can vote on it. But the negativism of Donald Trump, it's hard to do anything with it because all it is anger. And it's appealing to the worst of our instincts. In contrast, the next 4 years from Biden is liable to be about ideas, about fixing what he considers is broken, fixing what is not working for people. That's a sharp contrast to what we've had. He's going to tone down the rhetoric, but he'll be in the news every day, but it's going to be a positive spin, not a negative spin. And I think you're going to see that Donald Trump is pretty much going to disappear from view. He no longer has his Twitter connection to 70-some million followers. He doesn't have his Facebook connection. He's no longer a hot news item. Joe Biden is, the Biden administration. Most newspapers are not going to care what Trump says or does. He's now an ex-president and maybe a candidate to return to the presidency. But that's not the same as being the president of the United States, where your every word and action is recorded in the media. So, this is going to be a marked shift for us. The Biden team is planning a theme a day. And this is similar to what Obama did and George W. Bush did as well. You take a one constructive idea you want to implement, and that's what you stress today. Today it's the coronavirus. Tomorrow it could be immigration or the stimulus package. But it'll be one theme a day that that the administration wants to get across to the American public in a positive way. Now, a lot of people say, well, Joe Biden has 4 years to turn this country around. In fact, he's got about 20 months. He's got about a 20-month window to change minds, to get people to understand that they have to support this president, that he is trying to represent a broad swath of America and not just a narrow segment of the Democratic Party. Why do I say 20 months? Because we have a midterm election coming up in 2022. All the members of the House of Representatives are up for re-election. 1/3 of the US Senate is up for re-election. If things go badly in those 20 months for Biden, there's a strong likelihood that Republicans will gain control of the House of Representatives, and Nancy Pelosi will become the ex-Speaker of the House. There's also a pretty good chance that Republicans could control the US Senate in 2 years. It won't take much. That would make it almost impossible for Biden to implement his reforms. So a 21-month window for Biden until he has to go campaigning to get Democrats elected and increase their majorities in the House and the Senate. To do that, he has to get the coronavirus under control by late this year. And obviously, the sooner the better. And the key here is the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Johnson & Johnson in particular is the one to watch for because you only need one shot. And Dr. Fauci is predicting sometimes in the middle of February, the Food and Drug Administration may be able to approve that vaccine. But it's going to take time to ramp all of this up. It could be that getting to late spring is going to be very troubling. But for Biden, it's really about ramping this delivery system up from the chaos that he has inherited from the Trump administration. Sources are telling the Biden people, rather CNN has learned, that the Biden COVID transition team was shocked to learn that there really isn't any firm distribution program that's really workable, that they're going to have to go in starting today and reconstruct the entire distribution scheme of the federal government. Biden is also going to have to find ways for the federal government to come in and assist uh, Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson, Moderna in expanding their production lines. This will take time, but hopefully he can get the coronavirus under control by late this year, because the coronavirus is really what has dragged down the economy. If you get COVID to the point where the economy can start to reestablish itself, and Biden can pass a large stimulus package to tide businesses over until the coronavirus is starting to be behind us. If Biden can put in place an infrastructure project program all over the country, a work project, if you will, like they did in the New Deal, repairing deteriorating bridges, for instance, highways, mass transit, all sorts of constructive projects for water and sewer that are long overdue. Those are all job creating projects. And if you can do that all over the country, you're going to stimulate the heck out of this economy and US industries. And that could get us through the end of the year into next year. And probably businesses after COVID are going to take off like a rocket. So one thing about Joe Biden is that expectations have been set very, very low. They always have been. He's been underestimated his entire life. Nobody thought he was going to win the Democratic primaries for president. Has been. He's not a good speaker. He tends sometimes to stutter. It doesn't have new ideas. The left wing of the Democratic Party won't vote for it. He proved them all wrong. He was left in the in the dust in the first two primaries. Made a remarkable comeback, remarkable, because he stuck to his platform, his ideas, and he made it clear that he was the only Democrat who could beat Donald Trump. Moderate Democrats, especially African American Democrats, lined up behind him to a surprising degree, almost shocking. And he ended up winning the primary early and easily. He also ran an almost flawless campaign in the fall election against Trump. Nobody expected that from Biden, whose previous efforts to become president were halting and disorganized. Highly organized this time. Very, very impressive. His picks for his staff and his cabinet, very experienced people. They know what they're doing. I think he could be a surprising president. He's showing that, as all of us know, experience counts. It really does. I think we're going to see the reverse of that in Baltimore with our new mayor, who does not have any management experience at all. And I think it's going to be a lot of questions going forward if he can govern a major city. Donald Trump, no experience in government, and it showed. It really showed. Joe Biden has almost 50 years of experience in government, in federal governance in particular. Experience counts. He knows a lot of where the potholes are. He knows where most of the landmines are located and how to avoid them. Experience counts. He has surrounded himself with experienced individuals. So the Biden presidency is going to be what the German Chancellor Bismarck once called realpolitik. It's something that Henry Kissinger was famous for too. You take the reality on the ground and you deal with it as it is. Biden's going to start with healing steps, reversing Trump's extreme actions, calming the waters. We're going to be rejoining the Paris Accord on climate change. You're going to see very strong federal leadership on the coronavirus front, both in distribution, in the vaccination effort, direct aid from the federal government to hospitals in crisis. And I think you're going to see, like never before, Biden and Kamala Harris using the bully pulpit to promote mask wearing and vaccinations. You're going to see a huge effort to accomplish a lot in the first 100 days on the pandemic, infrastructure, which is really pumping a lot of money into the economy, federal money into the economy to stimulate the private sector and create jobs. Environment, getting serious about climate change. And in foreign policy, there's a lot of work to do or to undo. What do you do about Iran in the Middle East? What do you do about Iraq, Afghanistan? What do you do about China, the Korean Peninsula, Russia, Great Britain's breakaway from the European Union? I think you're going to see the Biden people be realists, clear-eyed realists. And you've already started to witness that. The first hearing from the next Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, at his confirmation hearing this week, was asked about Trump's move to shift the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And it was expected that Blinken was going to say, no, Jerusalem is an international city. We have to preserve it as such. And we're going to move our embassy back to Tel Aviv, the seat of the federal government in Israel. No, that's not what Blinken said. What he said was, we're not going to move the embassy. Jerusalem really is the capital of Israel. In a lot of ways, this was a stunning move that no one expected. It's a realistic move. It certainly is going to make it much easier for the State Department to work with Israel. It's going to make it more difficult to work with Arab nations, though. But it shows how far we've come from the ideological animosity expressed by the outgoing Secretary of State to the new Secretary of State. But here's another interesting foreign policy issue: China. Clearly, we've got huge difficulties with China, but let's face it, China is the world's greatest economic power. In a number of decades or less, China will be regarded as the superpower of the world economically. It's going to be known as the China century. We have to learn how to deal with it. Well, in her confirmation hearing, the new Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, this is what she said about China when she asked, is this our primary foe in the world? She said, China is adversarial and an adversary on some issues, and on other issues, we try to cooperate with them, such as climate change. Very important since China is a major contributor to air pollution with all their coal-fired plants. Then she said, that does not mitigate the fact that in espionage and other ways, the Chinese are an adversary and the intelligence community has to work to counter their aggressiveness and their unfair actions. Yeah, that's a pretty realistic view, which was underlined the next day by the next Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, retired general. He was asked, is China the biggest threat to the US in the world? And he said, yes, China is our biggest threat because it is, quote, a rising power. And that Russia is much less of a threat because it is, quote, a declining power. Boy, that comes right out of the handbook of foreign policy groups all over the world. It is a clear-eyed realism, and that I think is what's going to be followed by the Biden administration over the next 4 years. So for a moment or so, let's talk about the insurrection, the riot, the destruction of the Capitol. When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, he likened his movement to Andrew Jackson's movement. Andrew Jackson was, like Trump, an outsider, if you will. He was the first so-called Western president, Western being anything out near the Mississippi River. That's about as far as the country went back then. But he also represented the American underclass, the common folks, the lower middle class in America. And that's how Trump looks upon himself. But in reality, the Trump's 4 years turned out to be more like another Johnson who became president, Andrew Johnson, who pretty much gave us our problems today with civil rights. Terrible president, terrible. But the insurrection has torn apart the Republican Party. And now the question is, who controls the Republican Party? Is it the demagogues? Is it the extremists? Here's what a very respected Republican pollster, Whit Ayers, said about it. January 6th was the opening battle in the war for the soul of the Republican Party. The party is now split between the governing wing and the populist wing even more sharply than it was during the Tea Party period. The establishment, the leadership of the Republican Party is unable to control the fanatical pro-Trump wing of the party. And you could see that when the two Republican leaders in the House of Representatives refused to admit that Donald Trump had lost the election. One of Trump's most fanatical supporters, Roger Stone, who is known as Trump's dirty trickster. This is what he said: establishment Republicans have no votes among the people, and that Trump supporters should target elected Republicans who have opposed him. Stone even went so far as to say he was going to drive Senator Mitt Romney, out of Utah and place protesters at all of Romney's public appearances to shame and embarrass Romney. A poll among Republicans after the riots showed that a shocking 47% of Republicans said the attack on the Capitol was a legitimate protest. 47%, only 47%, said it was a mostly unlawful protest, mostly. 20% of those polled supported breaking into the US Capitol, and 16% believed in the QAnon conspiracy theories. If you're a Republican, that's pretty shocking. And the question is, what's left of my party? Is there anything here to save? This has led to, the insurrections led to some awful international reaction. It is interesting. There was one reaction in Germany where the ruling party had to vote on the likely successor to Angela Merkel later this year. And it was a vote for Armand Laschet. I hope I pronounced that right. He's a leader of the most populous state in Germany. He's going to lead Merkel's governing party before she steps down. And he now is in a position to impress enough Germans that he becomes the next chancellor. Here's what he said in his speech to the party. He portrayed himself as a unity candidate, sort of like Joe Biden. And here's another person who's always been underestimated and is not going to blow you away with his speechifying. But he pointed to the sharp divisions in the United States as an example of what extremism can do. And he said, trust is what keeps us going and what has been broken in America. By polarizing, sowing discord and distrust, and systematically lying, a president has destroyed stability and trust. We must clearly speak, but not polarize. Speak clearly, but not polarize. So, in democracies all over the world, they're using the Trump example of what not to do. And hopefully they'll see Biden as the example of what to do. So let's take a quick look back at the 2020 election. What did it show us? It showed that a majority of Americans, 7 million, wanted Trump gone. 7 million more voted for Biden than Trump, a record. They wanted Trump gone, and they liked some Democratic ideas. But there was no hunger for a revolution, either on the right under Trump or the left under someone like Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden won because he limited his promises. Number one, I will get rid of Donald Trump as president. I will, number two, lower the rhetoric. Number three, I will put competent people in charge. Number four, I will work quietly but effectively with Republicans to try to find common ground. And number five, I will embrace parts of the Democratic Party left-wing agenda, some of their ideas. But he's not going to create a revolution. That was enough for Biden to win by a small but decisive margin. And he won by taking two usually Democratic states, Michigan and Pennsylvania, plus, oddly enough, one congressional district in Nebraska, in the Omaha area, which is the only overwhelmingly liberal part of Nebraska. That was enough to put him over the top. He got to 270 electoral votes. The rest gave him a cushion, Georgia and Arizona. And while people say, boy, it was razor thin, actually, no. He won Pennsylvania by over 80,000 votes. He won Michigan by over 150,000 votes. And he won a landslide victory in Omaha. So he then picked up all of the states that Hillary Clinton had won before, and the election was his. He managed to shift a lot of minds of moderates and independents. And he won in the suburbs. Of the 100 largest counties in America, Biden won 91 of them. That's all suburbs. The Republican inner suburbs turned Democratic, and they've been trending that way for a number of years. Suburbs are dominated mainly by moderates, people who have moderate views, middle-class folks who don't want a revolution. They want change for the better, but they don't want a revolution. And that's basically what Biden was preaching. No revolution, but change for the better. In November and then again in January, we had some shocking results in Senate elections in Georgia. It was a repeat of the same trend. The suburbs turned from favoring a Republican candidate to favoring Democratic candidates. As a result, the US Senate is now narrowly controlled by Biden Democrats. 50-50 split. The vote, if tied, is broken by Kamala Harris as vice president. That is the narrowest of margins. It will mean that Joe Biden will have to do what he does best, cooperate with all of the US senators who are willing to sit down and find compromise, find common ground. And his destiny on many of his top proposals will not be controlled by Bernie Sanders and company. It will not be controlled by Elizabeth Warren. It will be controlled by the moderates in both the Republican and Democratic parties. If he can win them over, if he can shape his legislation in ways that appeal to people like West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, Montana Senator John Tester, the new Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. These are moderates. He's going to have to work with Susan Collins, the moderate Republican from Maine, Lisa Murkowski, the independent-minded Alaska senator, Mitt Romney, who has shown more courage, I think, than any other Republican in the country in his opposition to Donald Trump on a regular basis. Over in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi has a very slim majority, and she's going to have to fend off the ultra-radical liberals who do want a revolution. She's going to have to find a handful of Republicans from time to time that she can compromise with in order to pass legislation. She's got to remind her folks that the public likes middle-of-the-road ideas, that they can't, the Congress cannot pass extreme, ideologically driven legislation. Extreme rhetoric scares people, and we don't need that right now. It's going to be up to Joe Biden to try to rein in the crazies within the far left of the Democratic Party. And it's going to be interesting to see how many Republicans he can find who are willing to be practical and to work with him. Now, here's a historical fact you might want to keep in mind. Both the US Senate and the Electoral College are tilted strongly toward the Republican Party. And we've got to learn to live with that fact because the Electoral College is here to stay, at least in our lifetimes. The way the Electoral College is set up, every state gets 2 votes for its 2 senators. Plus, based on population, the number of congressmen they have in the House of Representatives. This means a state like Rhode Island or Montana or Utah or Idaho has more power than it really should have. And it means that the smaller states have an outsized role in the Electoral College. And most of those smaller states are Republican states. There are more rural states out west and in the South and Southwest. This makes it difficult for the Democratic Party. Same thing in the US Senate, because every state gets 2 representatives in the Senate. The smaller populated states, again, virtually all of them are Republican, have an outside advantage in the Senate. I have to learn to live with that. The nation as a whole has voted Democratic 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. Republicans have lost the popular vote, in other words, 7 of the last 8 presidential races. This is a yawning divide that is developing. Democratic Party now has what you would call a big tent philosophy. Lots and lots of people with different points of view all over the lot. Lots of quarrels. It's city and suburban focused now, but it's too often dominated by angry racial minorities. The old FDR coalition that included working white working class, blue collar voters is gone. It's gone over to the Republican Party. The blue collar, high school educated vote is gone over, especially among males, to the Republican Party. But the Republican Party is not expanding the base beyond that. It is becoming a closed circle party. It has purged Republican liberals. They no longer exist. They're getting rid of most of the moderates. Now, even moderate conservatives who disagree from time to time are being exorcised. It's becoming an ideologically pure, ultra conservative party that is white, deeply religious, especially fundamentalist religions, be they Christians, Catholics, or Orthodox Jews. It's becoming homogenous. And the radicalization of the Republican right under Trump has led a lot of them to support his brand of authoritarian rule, to the point that the Republican Party in this election had no platform. There was no Republican Party platform. If you ask what the Republican Party stood for in the last election, they couldn't tell you because they didn't have any platform. The only thing they stood for was Donald Trump. It was the cult of personality writ large. And that was the danger that we saw quite clearly. But meanwhile, Democrats are locked in an internal ideological feud. How they resolve that is a huge question. But the president is now the ultimate leader of the Democratic Party, and it's going to be incumbent upon the left wing of the Democratic Party to cooperate with their leader, Joe Biden. So, can Biden bring a unified Democratic Party to his administration? He did it in the election. Now he's got to do it for another 4 years. The big question on the other side is whether extremists will take over the Republican Party. In some states, this may already have happened. The Republican Party state chairman in Montana has called for the state to secede from the Union. The Republican Party state chair in Arizona still is claiming that Donald Trump won the election. This is a very bad sign for the Republican Party moderates, the establishment Republicans. Trumpism persists. Donald Trump is not going anywhere. Donald Trump is going to be the leader of the Republican Party until he decides not to be. This is going to raise questions. A lot of clear-thinking Republicans are going to say, is it even worth being a Republican any longer? Do they start a new party? Call it the Lincoln Party. Donald Trump has talked about maybe starting his own party, calling it the Patriot Party. The Republican Party may go the way of the Whig Party of the 1800s. We don't know, but we do know that there is a civil war raging among Republicans. Trump fanatics in the Congress are trying to get Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney's daughter, who's a congresswoman and the third ranking Republican in the House, to quit her leadership role and basically exorcise her from the party. Why? Because she said Trump did wrong in his January 6th speech, and he should have been impeached. Can't have dissension in the Republican Party of today. Where this leads in elections in 2 years is the big question. And Georgia is going to be a focal point of that. Watch Georgia. There's lots more to say, but I am quickly running out of time. Let me just conclude on Donald Trump. He is now a sulking president in exile. Or as Rupert Murdoch's New York Post said, the king of Mar-a-Lago ranting about the corrupt world. To a large degree, he is our King Lear. A man more sinned than sinned against. How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless nation. You can just hear Trump raving. But he's still going to be a major factor in this nation on the conservative side for a long time to come. How we deal with it is a question. Does he create a new megaphone for himself? A new cable network? What does he do? Lots of questions about that. Trump's notion of power, though, and this is interesting, is similar to Leon Trotsky's concept. Trotsky believed in an endless, all-encompassing worldwide struggle against established authority. And that's what Trump is all about. A war that never ends against established authority. Trotsky's permanent revolution had no fixed principles initially. Trump has no fixed principles. It's all about smashing the deep state, whatever that really is, and forcing all institutions to bend to his will. It's a cult of personality. His perpetual grievance machine has no interest in addressing those grievances just expressing them. It is ruled by cult of personality. Uh, and that's what the Republican Party is trying to fend off, so far without much success. Let me leave you with a comment from the past that some of you may have heard me mention before. It comes from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson that applies today. A little patience, and we shall see the reign of witches pass over, their spells dissolve, and the people, recovering their true sight, restore their government to its true principles. If the game runs against us, we must have patience till luck turns, and then we will have an opportunity of winning back the principles we have lost. For this is a game where principles are at stake. So I leave you with that thought, very much applicable, though it was echoed over 220 years ago. So I see we have about 11 questions.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions and comments. Barry, thank you very, very much for a most informative look into our possible future. There is a comment that I'd like to address first. It says, credit goes to Trump for the Abraham Accords. No other president was able to establish peaceful trade with Arab countries. Could you please address this?
Yes, I mean, this is probably going to go down as Trump's greatest accomplishment. The Jared Kushner was able to leverage trade agreements between Arab nations and Israel. It's going to be a long-term payback. It doesn't really change anything in the Middle East right now. But let's give Trump a lot of credit for some of the actions he took, and I think that is right at near the top of the list. But at the same time, if you're ever going to resolve the Israeli-Arab situation, you've got to address the Palestinian mess that you have on Israel's borders. And you can't do that necessarily by creating new settlements in contested territory. That's what's got to be discussed openly by both the US and Israel. The US also has to work with the Palestinians to get them to understand that there are limits to what they are going to be able to achieve in working toward a two-state arrangement, which is a long-term goal. What do you do in the interim that is beneficial for the Palestinians and for Israel's security? I think you're going to see some progress over the next 4 years, but it's not going to be dramatic because it's such a tough nut to crack.
This came, I think you addressed some of this, but it's worth asking. What fallout should the Republican Party expect following the refusal to concede the election to Biden, as well as the Capitol storm?
Well, the main area where the Republican Party is going to be hurt is, again, in the suburbs. Moderate Republican voters are going to turn away from the more extremist elements of the Republican Party. For instance, if the Montana Republican Party had followed the lead of its extremist chairman during the last election, we probably would have had another Democratic senator elected from Montana. That's where the impact is going to be greatest, where a lot of clear-thinking, middle road Republicans say, I can't take this anymore, even though I don't like voting Democratic, I will. Or I'm no longer going to register as a Republican. I'm going to register independent. Uh, there could be a sharp drop off in voter registration numbers in certain states among the Republican Party. And it could be that if too many extremists win Republican Party primaries, suddenly Democrats for governor or for state legislature who may have thought they had very little chance of winning are going to be in a prime position to pick up those Republicans in the suburbs who can no longer tolerate extremism within the Republican ranks.
This is probably a lecture in itself. The question is, what needs to be done to deal with the U.S. deficit?
Got any extra change on you? Want to take up a collection? Maybe we can all do that. As soon as Biden mentions tax increase, you're going to see the Republicans screaming and howling as though the world is about to end. But really, if you wanted to deal with the deficit situation, plus address the coronavirus crisis, the economic crisis in this country, our tax structure should be dramatically reformed. That's one thing. At the moment, you cannot rein in spending in the traditional way and expect that you're going to balance the budget in Washington. Trump has so blown the budget out of proportion. It will be decades and decades before it's back anywhere near in balance. Trillions of dollars of new deficits from Trump without blinking an eye. This is from the conservative candidate in the 2016 election. Biden is going to have to take some steps once the economy improves to slow the growth of spending, to shift priorities to the greatest needs, but then to tamp down spending in other areas and to stimulate the economy so that more revenue can be produced. That's about the best way to bring about a smaller deficit. But I expect that down the road, maybe not immediately, but down the road, we're going to have a big inflation problem in this country. And those of you who have some of their money in bonds will probably be happy that you have some money in bonds. That's down the road. That's not going to happen because of Federal Reserve policies over the short term. But once the economy returns and is stabilized, then I think you're going to see inflation start to kick up because of the overwhelming amount of government deficit in this country.
So this is a little lengthy. The question comment is, I am concerned that those of us who are Democrats and support Israel have problems with some of the extreme policies against Israel by the left part of the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, there is anti-Semitism and on the extreme right and left. Can you address how Biden might navigate this?
Yes, and it's interesting because the equivalent of the Democratic Party in Great Britain has that same problem. Only it's much more outspoken, the anti-Semitism within the Labour Party in Great Britain. How Biden can address it? Yes, Biden can address it by doing exactly what he's doing, steering a path in the middle of the road, insisting on equity and equality. Yesterday, he had a Zoom conference with his staff and said, anybody who I see disrespecting somebody else is going to be fired by me ASAP. I think those with anti-Semitic views in the Democratic Party, those with extreme pro-Palestinian views, are going to have to temper their words, or they may find themselves on the outside looking in without any influence on policy. And I think that's the best way to proceed for the Biden administration, to just keep steering that mid-road path in which you're fair to all sides.
Thank you. Next question. The New York Times today reports that the Proud Boys are calling Trump weak. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think he's weak for other reasons, but we won't go into that. Let me just say that the extremist groups are much smaller than were indicated by the riot in Washington on January the 6th. It looked for those of us who were watching as though the world were about to come to an end. The Proud Boys are going to be under the watchful eye of the FBI for the next 4 years. And if any of them step out of line, the arm of justice is going to reach out and grab them. The problem is within the Republican Party. Whether the extremists, the QAnon followers, there are 2 in the Congress from the Republican Party. If more are elected in some of these extreme Republican congressional districts or elected to state legislatures, the future of the Republican Party is at stake. That's the real danger here, I see. I think the FBI can handle the extremist groups, but let me just add one other thought. I'm glad in a lot of ways that we had this extremist outbreak in Washington, because this matter has been bubbling to the surface for decades. This is latter-day McCarthyism from the 1950s. And it goes even further back in American history. It's now out there in the open where it should be. It's being exposed, and it'll be exposed more and more by the Department of Justice run by Joe Biden. So, that's the good news out of all of this, that we are going to be dealing with. It won't be easy. Extremism will still be there, but we have to look at it. We have to look at extremism within the ranks of the military, the National Guard, and the Army. Germany's having that same problem within its police departments and its army with extremists, neo-Nazi extremists. So can we handle it? I think we can if we have the right leadership in Washington.
Thank you. This is a lengthy comment sort of question. I think the Democrats need to learn how to use simple messages to communicate, explaining how investing in new technologies in energy and other structural
Projects.
Yeah, there you go. Things and investing in education, childcare will be good for the economy.
Absolutely. This is the challenge. How do you simplify the message? This is the same for all politicians, by the way, or for all CEOs. You want to be a good communicator, learn how to simplify the message. Biden tends to do that. He wants to put things in terms that middle-class folks, lower middle-class folks, blue-collar folks can understand. And that's the challenge for not only Biden, but the Democratic Party, because they have basically forsaken blue-collar America. There's been such a focus within the Democratic Party on righting the wrongs of America's minorities that they haven't paid attention to American blue-collar workers, the lower middle class, or the upper lower class, if you will. The Republican Party has at least voiced some of these people's upsets. Biden and the Democrats have to readdress this. America's industrial policy is key to this. America's industrial might is a fraction of what it was a quarter century and a half century ago. China is eating our lunch in industrialization. How do you build that up again? How do you do that in a way with new technologies that could create hundreds of thousands of jobs? That's the challenge. And I think the Biden people recognize that and are already working on how you start reindustrializing America in some of these newer economic technologies that are going to be the leading edge of tomorrow.
And then the same person has another question about our media. She says, what about the Media Fairness Act? How can we control these media outlets, especially radio, that espouses lies without impunity?
Well, unfortunately, the Fairness Act hasn't been in place for almost half a century. It is, freedom of speech has ruled. And she's right that to a remarkable degree, some of what you see on Fox News, or a lot of what you see on Fox News, and on conservative talk radio is extremist babble.
Mm-hmm.
It's conspiracy babble to try, and it's all driven by ratings, trying to draw a bigger and bigger audience so you can charge your advertisers more. It's not driven by anything beyond that. How you control it is an interesting question that the new FCC may have some ideas on what to do, but the federal government may be a little more willing to bring media folks on the far extremes to account. But it's going to be a tough, tough road, especially since we live in an internet age where almost anything goes, unless you're Donald Trump, in which case you get barred from Twitter.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of rhetoric on Facebook and Twitter from many people. Next question, what will happen with the impeachment in the Senate?
Probably they will, Democrats will fall short of the 17 Republican votes they need to convict Donald Trump. I personally, I can't see how you get to 17. Even with Mitch McConnell's support of conviction, maybe you get to 12, maybe you get to 14. I don't see 17. It's just not there. It's just not there. Remember, the last impeachment trial, there was one Republican voting to impeach Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, the only one who had the guts to do it. I don't think that you have enough profiles and courage on the Republican side for that to happen this time. But remember, Trump still goes down in history as the only president to be impeached, which is the equivalent of being indicted twice.
Okay, and this question, do you think there will be more rebellion? Kind of an open-ended question.
Yes, I do. I think, unfortunately, that you're going to see some sieges of state capitals or attempted sieges of state capitals at unexpected moments. And that's the danger out there. I don't think you're going to have that danger in Washington. You may have protests, but I think the National Park Service is now going to be very, very strict about allowing protests anywhere near government buildings.
I think
That you may have protests in parks around Washington, but not necessarily on the mall the way it has been.
Thank you. Do you think there was corruption in the last election or just false voter fraud accusations? Do you think the popular vote should replace the Electoral College? Two questions.
Virtually no examples of fraud have been found in any of the 50 states. Not one. So, I think that answers itself. Please remember that in today's age, when you go to vote by mail, there's a barcode on your ballot. That prevents you from voting twice. When you go in to vote in person, the computer has to recognize you as a voter, and you can't vote a second time. It's almost a fail-safe system. So no, there wasn't any fraud in this election. You can make the claim that in 1960, John F. Kennedy won the election because Mayor Daley in Chicago came up with enough votes to throw Illinois to the Democrats. But you can't make that argument now. Georgia and the Republican governor and the Republican Secretary of State proved that. Absolutely. Replacing the Electoral College, you tell me how that is done, and then we can discuss whether it's going to happen. Small states will not permit the Electoral College to disappear because small states have such an advantage in the Electoral College. You're not going to get enough states to go along, and that's the problem.
Thank you. Now, what about Trump's consequences for his criminal, civil, and illegal actions? Will he ever go to prison?
Cyrus Vance III, I think he's the third, who is the district attorney in New York, in Manhattan, is pursuing a criminal investigation of Trump for lying about his business assets and overvaluing his assets in a tax scam. That's one criminal investigation. There's a civil investigation by the Attorney General of the state of New York. There are defamation lawsuits against Trump, civil defamation lawsuits. Would not surprise me at all if the new U.S. attorney in Florida starts looking into the new resident of Florida to see what could be pursued. And then you have, interestingly enough, the situation in the District of Columbia, where Trump now, as a private citizen, could be charged based on leading an insurrection. It'd be an interesting case that the Supreme Court might ultimately throw out, but it could be pursued. So that's just on the surface. Going forward, if Trump continues to espouse wild claims and charges, all sorts of other lawsuits could be pursued against Trump. Plus, his businesses are in terrible shape. New York Times had an article about all the money that the Trump organization lost in 2020. And who's going to stay at a Trump hotel now? His leverage as president is gone. This could be a rocky road for the Trump organization. But do not count Donald Trump out. He is a master showman. His whole life has been presenting a false facade to America about who Donald Trump is, the Trump organization, and so forth. He is a master businessman about conning money lenders into giving him dough for this and that. He has already raised $250 million for his next political campaign, and he can siphon a lot of that money off into his own private slush funds. And because he has such a devoted following, he can solicit them for all sorts of additional monies. So, will Trump be held to account? In many ways, he will be, but he's still going to be with us.
Okay, well, maybe now you could get a really good rate at the Trump Towers. Okay, this comes from Miriam Stern. And Miriam, if I'm saying this incorrectly, I apologize. What about, it looks like OAN question mark?
QAN
I
probably.
think it's QAN. I think she means QAnon.
Yeah.
One
Well,
American News. It's probably One American News she means. No?
yeah.
Or QAnon.
Well, the
QAnon
problem
or One
is,
American News, one of those two.
the problem is that the right-wing media is still there. Fox News is still there. The Murdoch family is still committed to extreme rhetoric in their newspapers and on their TV stations. The QAnon movement is wacky. It attracts only the most unhinged people,
Mhm.
the people who want to believe whoever shouts the loudest and is the most charismatic. The QAnon followers are very much like Hitler followers in the 1930s. They followed the leader with these wild conspiracy theories, not because they had any proof, but because the leader said so. And that's what you have with QAnon. And unfortunately, there are just a lot of registered Republicans who are willing to believe the lie. And until the Republican Party and its leadership has the courage to recognize that long term they cannot continue to exist if they're led around by the nose by the QAnon conspiracy followers, the extremists within their midst, because they will start losing election after election after election as they're the moderate wing of the Republican voting electorate atrophies.
Thank you. So what do you think Congress will do with Cruz and Hawley regarding their apparent cooperation with the events of January 6th?
They're pretty much going to be put in a corner. You know, Josh Hawley in particular, I think has destroyed his chances to ever be president of the United States. He has lost any hope of going beyond the Republican nomination, but he's still going to make that attempt, as is Ted Cruz. So he cannot be ignored by Republicans. The Democrats, though, I think are going to totally ignore him as much as they can. But it's going to be up to the Republican Party again. Are they going to be a real party with real ideas, or are they going to be a negativist party of anger that becomes an authoritarian party in the Trump mode, or in the Cruz mode, or in the Hawley mode? And you know, Hawley in particular is gambling on Trump not running in 4 years, and that he will be the voice for the disenchanted among the Republicans, the voice of anger. We shall see. We haven't heard the last of Hawley, but as far as influence in Washington, slim and none.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, what will be the impact of the filibuster?
Interesting question. Republicans will fight like heck to preserve the filibuster, which means on many issues you need 60 votes in order to pass a bill, which is virtually impossible unless it's a very watered down bill. I don't know that Biden's going to try to change the filibuster rule because it would be so difficult. But he'll try to work around it. You don't need 60 votes on bills that have a budget impact. You only need 51 votes. So I think he's going to try to work around the filibuster rule. If all else fails, he may try to get rid of it. I think it's more likely that he'll just narrow the 60 votes to maybe 55 votes so that if you want to pass something by ending a filibuster on a bill, you're going to have to at least get 5 Republicans to vote with you. Um, uh, Biden is a traditionalist. He spent 36 years in the US Senate. He understands the value of the filibuster to the party that is out of power, which could well be the Democrats in a short time. Um, so that's a real dicey situation. Possibly in 2 years, if Democrats pick up 2, 3, or 4 seats in the Senate in the midterm elections, then they might try to narrow the filibuster down to a number that is doable and not almost impossible, um, except in the most extreme cases.
Okay.
If Cece and Barry, we could go on for a long time, asking questions. So I just want to take a few minutes and say thank you, Barry,